the car was actually reasonably pacey. Not quite good enough for pole position, but definitely up there at the sharp end of the grid and able to compete. So why did everything go so poorly this weekend? We entered the race with high hopes, a car that was quick in the dry, a car that had been reasonably quick in the tricky-ish conditions, half wet, half dry on Saturday, and no real concerns about the pace. Looking forward to a strong race. But sometimes in races things don't go your way. Sometimes in races a small error here, a small error there, and you find yourself falling away from the rhythm of what keeps the car flowing. The tyres need to be at the right temperature all the way through the weekend. And a little mistake here, a little mistake there, and suddenly you're on the back foot, and it just feels, instead of having the race you expected, that you are just watching a machine that you've wound up and is now going to tick its way down to the conclusion. A machine that is not delivering you the happiness that you thought you would have, but instead is just meting out pain lap after lap after lap as you watch, sort of rather helplessly, trapped by it and the victim of it until the race reaches its conclusion. Were we happy with the delayed start? Would it have been better for us to get going at the regular start time? I think it was absolutely the right call for the sport. The track was really very wet. The heavens had opened. There was an enormous amount of water fell on Singapore in the lead up to the race, and it had to get to a point where we could start the race safely. So no, it was inevitable that the race needed to be delayed, and we were very, very content to see it so. Why was George's PU changed at a track where that is definitely going to be difficult to overtake? There's a couple of places. Singapore is one, Monaco another, where changing a power unit between qualifying and the race is no fun. But sometimes you have to do what you have to do. The power unit had reliability concerns hanging over it, and finishing in the race is better than not finishing in the race and blowing up a power unit. So we thought it was the right call to make, to put a fresh one in. And actually, had it been a dry race, we were predicting that George would have got himself very strongly back into the points in any case. Was there any other tyre option that we could have considered at the start of the race for Lewis? Well, I can take a couple off the table straight away. It was way too wet for us to remotely consider using a slick tyre. Similarly, it was nothing like wet enough for us to start on the extreme wet rubber. So the only choice was intermediate, and the only discussion was what flavour of intermediate we should be putting on the car. Two choices. You can either go out with brand new rubber, fresh rubber, or you can use a used intermediate, one that has had some scrubbed work done on it in some previous laps. Now, the two options give you slightly different things. The brand new rubber is going to give you your best chance off the line at the start itself. It's going to give you your best jump, it's going to give you your best chance into the first corner. The scrubbed rubber, however, will probably just find its feet a little bit more sure-footedly in those opening laps of the race. It will let the driver feel more comfortable straight away. In the end, collectively, we discussed it back in the garage before the race, and we decided on the fresh intermediate approach being the correct one. And that indeed ended up being the choice made by all those around us immediately on the grid. Was the performance of the team compromised by the damp track? Well, obviously, in one sense, of course it was, that everybody's lap times, the entire grid's lap times are compromised by the damp track. Makes a massive difference to the performance of the car, whether it's a wet or a dry track. That much is obvious. The question is whether or not we were compromised in a relative sense. Was our car more affected by that wet track than others? I would say not, honestly. We had seen on Saturday, when you are on your own on the track in qualifying laps, that we had similar damp conditions. The track went from intermediate to dry conditions throughout qualifying, and we were competitive throughout all phases of that. In the race on Sunday, yes, it was tricky, yes, it was greasy, yes, it wasn't easy, but we never really had a chance to show what the car was capable of because both our drivers were penned in behind others who were slowing them down for the whole of the race. What happened to our pace? We were obviously quick in qualifying, but it's seemingly not being able to reproduce it in the race. Well, I think that's very much just a a fact of life of racing on a wet track that is very difficult to overtake on with two cars that are a bit out of position. In case of George, very out of position. He's right at the back of the grid trying to make his way through, and so coming up against cars that are way slower than he is. So you never really got to see George's pace. In the case of Lewis, he was behind a car that he'd been quicker than in qualifying because of not managing to stay ahead of Sainz in the first corners. And thereafter was penned in by a slower Sainz in front of him, and so unable to show the pace that he had in the car. In the very opening laps of the race, where it looked as a little while that he might be struggling to live with Sainz's pace, that was pretty much dictated by the fact that in that first corner battle with Sainz, where Lewis was pushed wide, that meant that Lewis went through a lot of standing water with his tyres. That immediately took 10 degrees out of the rubber, 10 degrees centigrade out of the rubber, and made it so that it was very difficult for him to find grip in the subsequent laps. Takes a few laps then to get the thing back up to sort of the temperature that you wish to have, but by the time he did that, he was able to pull up to Sainz's bumper and was then penned in by that. Are there any positives we can take from the weekend, and can they be carried forward to Japan, and in fact, I would add, to the races beyond? Well, I think there are plenty of positives, despite the fact that I think no one in our team colours would describe that as a good race on Sunday. But there are positives to take from it. Singapore has traditionally been a very difficult track for this team. Not difficult in the way that we saw on Sunday, but difficult because we've struggled to show any sort of pace at that track, even in years where we've been very, very dominant in every other track. Well, this weekend we showed on Friday in free practice 1, we showed it again on qualifying, that the car was actually reasonably pacey. Not quite good enough for pole position, but definitely up there at the sharp end of the grid and able to compete. We saw on the Friday that it had very good long run pace as well and would have had a decent race in normal circumstances. So those are things that make us feel good. If we cast our mind back several races earlier in the season, well, it was a very, very different animal back then, and we've managed to progressively make it quicker through the whole year. There will be tracks ahead of us, I'm sure, which won't be as easy or won't be as strong in qualifying pace as we've seen at Singapore, at Zandvoort, at Hungary, for example. But I'm pretty confident that the pace we showed this weekend in free practice, in qualifying, that pace will carry forward to a good extent in the remaining tracks of the year. Do I think there's still a chance for the team to get its first win this season? Well, the answer to that is yes. There's been a number of occasions this year where, had things been just slightly different, that win would already be in our pockets. Now, it is the case when you're not the strongest car that those wins come slightly by serendipity. They are not won with pure brute force in the way that we've been able to in past seasons. But nevertheless, when the car is quick enough to be near the front, and with all the uncertainty that can happen in a race, then with a following wind, you can get a race win. Now, I think there have been sufficiently large number of occasions this year where we have been up the front, sort of putting ourselves in the position to benefit from that good fortune, that it's likely that at some point over the remainder of this season, something like that will fall in our favour. And it will be great if it does. But I think all of us in the team, and I'm sure all of you who are fans of the team, would be happy with that, but not content. Because we will only be properly happy, properly content, when we have a car that's able to win from the front by rights each weekend that we put it on a track. And that's what we're aiming for. Thanks very much for all your questions. We'll be back in a week from now to answer some more in the debrief after the Grand Prix in Suzuka.